Hello everyone. Today, we're bringing you the story of a young writer who, along with his wife, went on a trip to meet a beautiful woman and a spoiled man who destroys himself in pursuit of pleasure, only to fall into a horrible abyss. This fairy tale holiday island, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, boasts the most beautiful sandy beaches, the clearest waters, and the most luxurious entertainment. Many of the richest men in the world choose to live here. It was spring break, and James, a young writer, had brought his wife Amy to the island for what he thought would be a wonderful trip. However, what happened was beyond imagination. That morning, the couple went to the sandy beaches to relax. Magnet Square was full of people, some enjoying the sunshine on the beach, others drifting along on their sand motos. From time to time, cries of surprise could be heard amongst the throngs of people, and the entire island was filled with a sense of wonder and delight. After dinner, Lee, who was young and energetic, hurried to the swimming pool with Amy, while James strolled alone on the sandy beach. A pretty girl with a cool demeanor approached him, mentioning that she had read his novels and introduced herself with her real name. During the conversation, Elena introduced her husband Jason to James. At the end of the conversation, the couple invited James to join them for dinner, which he accepted. That night, James and his wife, Amy, went to a Chinese restaurant where they had dinner and discussed life. Elena mentioned that she and her husband Jason had met in Hollywood and were best friends. They took time every year to vacation on the island, an exclusive spot for the rich. Jason, a member of the band The Famine, didn't provide a steady income, and very few writers could afford to spend money on the island. As James nonchalantly enjoyed the food in front of him, he did not intend to respond positively, while his wife Amy seemed restless. The atmosphere in the place swallowed up the brief awkwardness, and though James said nothing, it was clear he resented his wife's remarks. After all, no man likes to admit that he is useless and dependent on a woman for his livelihood. Elena, who had been listening to the conversation, never took her eyes off James, and the subtle resentment James had just shown on his face did not go unnoticed by her. Mr. and Mrs. James renewed their invitation to join them for a picnic the next day, and also invited them for a drink at James's door, but Elena begged to be excused. The next morning, James was easily persuaded to join them again. They talked until they reached the appointed place, where Elena and her husband, Jason, had hired a long-topped runabout, which was ready with drinks and food. The party soon set out on their journey, and as the runabout drew nearer to the island, the whole scene came into sight, with its trees, water, and blue skies, a breathtaking view from every angle. The long-topped roadster finally halted at a small cove with clear water, where Jason set up the barbecue and began grilling sausages. Elena took her lounge chair to enjoy the sunshine, while James's eyes fell upon her. She tried her best to conceal her inner stirrings by appearing as innocent as possible. Elena, who had already noticed James's intentions, subtly revealing her interest. Meanwhile, Jason, who had been drinking heavily, left James to drive the car. As the afternoon had been intense for Elena, it was difficult for her to concentrate. With low visibility at night, James accidentally knocked a passerby out of the way. Jason quickly got out of the car to check on the person, who was covered in blood and had been fatally injured. James and Amy were devastated, but Elena and Jason remained remarkably calm. James considered the situation and decided to call the police, but as he reached for his cell phone, Elena stopped him. She explained that in this part of the world, unlike their home country, it was better to act as if nothing had happened. The area was under constant surveillance, making it difficult for the police to reach them. In the early morning of the 4th, the local police knocked on James's door, claiming they had evidence of a hit-and-run accident. Realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, James had no choice but to be taken away by the police, with Amy as a witness, who was also taken into custody. James was routinely briefed on the local laws, which stated that a fatal hit-and-run accident is a felony, and a hit-and-run is an even more serious crime. James immediately grew nervous and asked the sheriff if there was any way to avoid the charges. After a moment's thought, the sheriff responded, "There are few things that money can't solve. In this world, there is a very powerful scientific research organization secretly working on cloning technology. If you want to escape the crime, you can pay them to create a cloned human being to endure the punishment." The sheriff then took out a contract he had already prepared, clearly anticipating that James would opt for this less expensive solution. When everything was ready, James entered the so-called cloning room. He was covered in an unidentifiable liquid, and as the air began to circulate, he felt nothing but dizziness and soon lost consciousness. After a short time, James woke up on his back, and his wife, who was standing nearby. Inside the laboratory, Karanti was encased in a petri dish, and as James approached him, Karanti had just awakened, and both were startled. Karanti tried to get up, but his body was restrained by a collarbone attachment. James dared not release him and hurriedly left the laboratory. As the day of execution approached, Karanti was tied to the crucifix, while James was compelled to witness the event, which had been orchestrated by a young boy. As the son of the deceased, the boy had the right to execute the sentence. Trembling, he raised the knife towards Clanty. Despite the man's pleas, the boy plunged the dagger into Clanty's abdomen. As the blood flowed out, Clanty became still. Amy was horrified at the sight of Clanty's murder, especially since the man bore an uncanny resemblance to her husband. At the same time, James showed an almost imperceptible smile, as if the dead man meant nothing to him. or perhaps he was somehow thrilled by his death. After the execution, the police handed Clanty's ashes to James and his wife, marking the end of the grim ordeal. Following this event, Amy completely lost her interest in the island trip. Once they returned to the hotel, she was eager to leave. In fact, James had mentioned that he was packing their bags and ready to depart, but he couldn't find his passport anywhere. It seemed they wouldn't be able to leave anytime soon. As night fell, the couple lay on the bed, their hearts heavy with unease. Amy, lying with her back to James, whispered her feelings. "I don't understand why Clanty's death didn't affect you. Beyond indifference, I felt nothing from you." Unable to sleep in the tense atmosphere, she got up and left James alone in the room, seeking out Elena, the only person who could offer her some comfort. Sensing Amy's restlessness, Elena invited her to a private party at the hotel. When James opened the door to join, he was met with a room full of people, all top millionaires from around the world. Jason's behavior after meeting James was particularly striking. She couldn't guarantee the safety of these people, so she cautiously warmed up to the idea and introduced him to the middlemen. James quickly assimilated, engaging in conversations with them. The rich and famous in the room had heard about paying clones to die in their place, but Jason offered a new perspective. "Listen," Jason began. "When you wake up in that little room in the lab, there's no way of knowing if you're the same person you were before. What if the real you is already dead, and what's alive now is just a clone? That thought is terrifying, isn't it? But honestly, as long as I feel alive, that's all that matters. Who cares if it's the original or a clone?" He turned his gaze to James, who responded with a light smile. "I'd like to think that my old, weak self died, and now I've been revived, renewed. It feels pretty good, actually." James had clearly shown he was fitting into this world well. After briefly leaving her master's sight, she retreated to the bathroom, trying to clear her head with cold water. But Elena found her again, leading her back to the gathering room where the atmosphere had grown tense. Someone stood up, suggesting they needed a thrill beyond the usual rich people games. They proposed committing a robbery, masked, with clones doing the dirty work in exchange for a fee. The group seemed unfazed, casually handing over money, as if they were buying mere entertainment. It dawned on James that everyone present, including Erina and Jason, had gone through what he had experienced, using clones as death substitutes, possibly more than once. Although he was reluctant to join their twisted game, he knew too much. Backing out now could cost him his life, for the law held no power over them anymore. She couldn't guarantee their safety anymore. Just as James hesitated, a gun was pressed against her chest, threatening to shoot her dead at the first sign of trouble. In this way, the group, under the cover of darkness, broke through the glass door of the souvenir store. Each picked out a horror mask, and with the masks on, the evil side of their hearts was completely released. With immense joy, they rushed to the villa, before the hero or heroine could realize what was happening. Before James and the heroine could understand, they were seized by their unwelcome guests. The heroine was stripped of her dignity and clothes. The intruders scavenged for loot like robbers. Though the rich men had wealth, they were thrilled by the sensation of holding others' belongings with absolute power. As Ariana approached James and tried to teach her how to shoot an innocent man, James instinctively resisted but couldn't stop her. Ariana snatched the gun, pointed it at the man in the villa, and a bodyguard hiding in the corner fired. A fierce shootout ensued in the villa. The woman inside was killed instantly. Jason was shot in the leg and collapsed, and the bodyguard was fatally wounded. After the incident, the women who sought the thrill were captured by the police. James, too, was arrested as an accessory to the crime, all in an attempt to save their own lives. Yet, even after being caught, the rich men laughed, confident in their wealth. They believed they could manipulate the legal system to evade justice. However, what they failed to realize was that the sheriff had already informed them there were limits to what they could get away with. They couldn't continuously exploit the law. As a resolution from the trial court, the death penalty was decreed for all of them. Despite their desperate resistance and struggle, the tycoons couldn't avoid being beheaded. At that moment, James regretted everything. If only he had not gotten involved with Elena, none of this would have happened. But it was too late. The group was taken to the execution grounds and beheaded. Looking back to the grandstand, the women remained alive, with a disturbing exuberance. It was as if they had finally understood the twisted pleasure of their own cruel games. Later that afternoon, James returned to the hotel for the second time, carrying his own ashtray. Amy, overwhelmed by disgust, couldn't resist the urge to leave. The man before her had become a stranger, repeatedly making her pay exorbitant cologne fees. James tried to explain, but Amy refused to listen. At the end of their parting, Amy set out on her own and returned home, leaving James still on the island, enchanted by the western beaches. James, lounging on a bench with a tomato, was scarcely moved by his wife's departure. Now unencumbered, she was free to live more freely, just as the rich and powerful did. Elena, who had actually come to see them, was preparing for a deep, passionate exchange with James, but they were interrupted by a sudden downpour. James followed Elena back to the hotel, and the two of them finally consummated their encounter. Under the influence of drugs, James's mind was a chaotic whirlwind of strange and bizarre scenes, which eventually blurred into confusion. Days passed, and James fell into a state of complete degradation. That night, he was caught up in a secret party with Elena's father, where the event's theme was torture and murder. Having taken a large amount of dangerous drugs, James went on a rampage, assaulting a man until he fell to the ground. When the hood was removed, James froze in shock. The man he had been beating was his clone. Unable to distinguish reality from illusion, James realized his true role in their twisted game. He was nothing more than a toy for their amusement. The couple wanted to test whether James would still be frightened upon seeing his clone. As the hood was removed, James felt as if his world had collapsed. Amid the mockery, he fled the scene in the dead of night. Elena came to comfort him, claiming it was merely a joke. Meanwhile, the wealthy patrons were eager to purchase James's clone. After Elena's explanations, James felt deeply betrayed. That night, James quietly retrieved his passport, which he had hidden under the van. He had previously claimed to have lost it, but in reality, he had concealed it on purpose. With no room left for him on the island, he decided it was time to leave. He needed to reach the airport and escape the island for good, but the rich would not let him go so easily. On his way to the dam, the wealthy stopped him with their cars. Elena, furious at James for not bidding farewell, threatened him with a gun. James was forced to exit the car, marking the moment when the writer, once part of the elite, became nothing more than a plaything for the rich. At the end of their ordeal, Mr. and Mrs. Elena took the initiative to mock James openly. "I'm not a fan of yours at all," Elena sneered. "I've never even read any of your books. All this time, we've been treating you as nothing more than a toy. You're just a weak, pathetic worm in the game we've been designing." Her attitude grew increasingly wild, and just then she accidentally spilled her wine and dropped her gun. Seeing no chance to improve his situation, James desperately fled to the side of the road. Elena fired, hitting him in the leg, and he collapsed. Soon after, James awoke in a crude cave house, realizing someone had come to his rescue. As he dripped his way toward the door, he found himself facing the rich and powerful, who were waiting with a party of bobbing headlights. His head spun from the disorienting lights, making it difficult for him to keep up. In the final act, James was dragged out like a dog and confronted with Clanty, the rich man who had orchestrated these cruel games. Clanty and James were forced to fight, with James initially struggling. However, driven by sheer determination, he managed to gain the upper hand. He mounted Clanty and pounded him until his head was completely destroyed. After this brutal fight, James's trials in Hell City seemed to end. As the rainy season began, all the tourists, including James, were required to leave the island. James's suitcase was now filled with bones and ashes. At the river before the bus departed, the once rich and famous appeared as different people, putting away their tyrannical facades and donning new disguises. They departed for home, while Elena and her companions engaged in final conversations, seemingly unconcerned with the chaos that had unfolded. After James said his goodbyes and hoped to spend a vacation with her next year, only a few strangers remained in the hall. As James's eyes swept over the faces around him, he felt increasingly puzzled by how normal everything seemed. Was what had happened merely an illusion? Was the previous pain and chaos just a figment of his imagination? Caught in deep self-doubt, James found himself reflecting on his experiences. The scene shifted back to the hotel where James had been staying, where another version of James stood alone in the pouring rain, frowning and lost in thought. He was desperately trying to discern what was real and what was not. As people left, James wondered whether they were still the same individuals they once were. The advancements in natural science and technology had profoundly changed human life, but they also brought great concerns. It's like a double-edged sword, revealing Pandora's box as it cuts through the mysteries of nature. Cloning technology, a significant branch of human science, had sparked debates in the academic community. There were fears that such technology could be misused, creating a universe of horror. The question remains, is it more terrifying to see ourselves emerging from the shadows? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section. That's all for now. Thank you for your support. See you in the next issue.